Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is Liz joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the ancestral lands of the Monacan Nation, a federally recognized tribe with headquarters that are not very far from me. And if you want to know whose lands you're residing on, as always, you can check out native-land.ca. And I always put this in the show notes, but I'm starting with this episode. I'm putting a link to an organization called the Coalition of Natives and Allies as well. CNA was founded by one of my prior podcast guests, Arla Patch, who also happens to be the cover artist for my book, which is pretty cool. I'll mention that in a second. But this is a coalition of Indigenous women and white allies, and they have a lot of really good resources on their website. So go check out the show notes and see what you can learn. And as always, I got to give you guys a little plug for my book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine, is available now from Womancraft Publishing. Whether you are new to this exploration of the sacred feminine and are looking for more information, or you've been on this path for a while and maybe you want to take a deeper dive into her history and some of the spiritual attributes associated with her, check it out. It is a 2023 Nautilus Gold Award winner. Yay! Pretty exciting for me. Oh, I'm getting snaps from you can hear my my guest there. Nautilus Awards honor books that promote sustainability, conscious living, and spiritual growth. And some of my favorite authors have received these in the past, including our guest today. So I feel really proud to be in good company. You can order my book from Womancraft. You can order it. You can get it wherever you want to get it. But I love to tell you to think about ordering it from Womancraft Publishing, which is an amazing independent woman-owned publisher, or go get it from your favorite local independent bookstore. And do you mind putting it on mute for a second?
No, I don't mind at all.
Okay, all right.
Of course.
Okay. And as always, I am grateful for reviews. Reviews on Amazon and Goodreads are super helpful for other people to find the book. And the same goes for this podcast. I really appreciate your favorable reviews. Anywhere you want to leave them is awesome, but iTunes and Apple Podcasts in particular are great to have. And as always, your feedback is welcome. And you know what? I feel like you guys are really hearing me on this because I've definitely had more people reach out to me directly with feedback and input and reflections. And I so appreciate your taking the time to do that. It helps me think about different aspects of things that we're talking about here. And it's nice to know that you're out there listening. So I really appreciate that. And always feel free to reach out to me via social channels, and I will put that in the show notes as well. Okay, so let's get on to the main event. I am really honored to have my guest on today. I have known about her and followed her work for years, and I'm thrilled that she's with me to speak about it. So let me go ahead and introduce her to you now. Nina Simons is co-founder and chief relationship officer at Bioneers, an innovative nonprofit organization that highlights breakthrough solutions for restoring people and planet. She also leads its Every Woman's Leadership program. Throughout her career spanning the nonprofit, social entrepreneurship, corporate, and philanthropic sectors, Nina has worked with nearly 1,000 diverse women leaders across disciplines, race, class, age, and orientation to create conditions for mutual learning, trust, and leadership development. She co-edited Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart, and authored the book Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership, released as a second edition in 2022 with an accompanying discussion guide and embodied practices. The first edition won Nautilus Awards in the categories of Women in the 21st Century and Social Change and Social Justice. And both books are being used to inspire and ignite learning in individual circles and classrooms. Nina is joining us today from near the mountains outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Nina, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you with me.
Liz, it's an honor to be here with you. And I should say, I'm joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Tewa, Tiwa, and Keres speaking people, also known as the Pueblo peoples. And I'm very grateful to be here. Feels like finding a sister in purpose and mission.
Oh, I felt that way so much too, just reading your book too. So that's the first thing I want to say is listeners, check out this book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. It is beautiful. It is profound. It is mature in the best possible way, grounded spirituality. And I think it's deeply intersectional work. And so I just, my copy is very dog-eared and underlined. And I highly recommend it to everyone who's listening. And I know we're going to talk about it and get into some of the themes in it for sure. But Nina, where I usually like to start with guests is to get a little bit of your spiritual background. And I always ask that because I'm curious, first of all. And second, I love to hear where people started and, compared to where they are now. Was there anything useful that sort of pointed you in the right direction, or did you have to reorient, or what was that like for you?
Well, that's a great question. Okay, let's see. Well, I grew up in New York City, and I am the daughter of two people of Jewish descent, but I was raised without any religious background, but simply with a cultural orientation that said, leave the world a better place than when you arrive. And what I had noticed early on in my childhood was that nature was where I went for solace. And my parents were really agnostic, didn't practice any kind of specific spirituality. But when I was in need of solace, when my emotional life was turbulent, I went to the park or I went to nature. And so in many ways, I think that has led me to where I am today, where I believe that nature, or what I call mother life, is really as close. It's what I hold sacred. It's what I believe is the divine. And so it's my version of the divine feminine, is life all around us. Along the way, I had the opportunity to study with a spiritual school in my 20s called Eureka, that was created by a Bolivian mystic named Oscar Ichazo. And he had traveled the world and really created a school for consciousness that brought together aspects of many of the world's great traditions and religions. And so I learned a lot of tools there, which I've always been grateful for, perhaps the most important of which was not only to learn to sort of to meditate and how important diet and my inner world was, but also to be able to witness myself without being totally identified with everything that I felt or believed or experienced. And since that time, I've had a very eclectic spiritual training, and I've learned a great deal from Indigenous mentors. I so appreciated your opening, Liz. Thank you for that. And also I've been studying from some of the world's great wisdom traditions, from Buddhism a lot, and from Sufism and Hinduism. And I sort of, I learn and glean from anything that feels useful. And it's always interesting to me to see how the spiritual truths that I'm learning are applicable to the natural world, and how they relate. So, I mean, in many ways, I am an eclectic studier of many things, and I feel like I'm a systems student overall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Including, I've studied astrology for many, many years.
Okay. Well, and I was going to ask you, what do you mean by a systems student? Can you expand on that?
Sure. Well, part of what I learned in Eureka was the Enneagram. And so the Enneagram is this beautiful 9-pointed star. And really, it describes the whole arc of human behavior. And what I learned during that time of study was that there tends to be one place where we get stuck somewhere in early childhood. And that stuck place tends to be like habit forming. It's a place where our psychology develops around, but we all contain all 9 of them within us. And similarly, astrology, of course, with the zodiac and the 12 signs and understanding some of the symbology of the planets, Um, I'm increasingly believing that we are a part of a conscious cosmos and that there is consciousness not only in human beings, but, scientists are discovering now that plants can perceive color. And it used to be that they thought that, they would describe animal intelligence by being whether an animal could identify itself in a mirror. Well, it turns out all kinds of animals can identify themselves in a mirror, and slime mold can find its way through a maze. So, what is intelligence anyway? And so I'm intrigued by both the visible world and the invisible world. And I think astrology speaks to me about it's like understanding the weather system. Wouldn't you want to know if it's likely to rain on a day when you're going out or if it's going to be over 100 degrees? And I feel like that's what I look to astrology for, is to get a sense of the energetic weather that I'm stepping into.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that perspective. I also love the Enneagram. I know there are so many different tools that are out there, and that's one that's definitely resonated for me. And I'm grateful for what you said about astrology too. I'm guessing listeners here are you may be more open to astrological insights perhaps than other folks potentially, but I it's such a deep and profound system, and everybody that I've known that has worked very closely with it, just the level of scientific and mathematical understanding that you have to have. It's just far deeper than, reading 3 lines in a newspaper or a magazine. So I'm with you there.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is that there's a realm of astrology called world transits. And my husband and partner actually made a 10-part series that you can see online called Changing of the Gods. And it's about how the planet's relationship to each other affects events on Earth. And historically, it was inspired by a book called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas, who was a historian who mapped the events of human history and how and whether they correlated to movements of the outer planets in relation to each other. And he found incredible correlations. And so the series is something that I would highly recommend to anyone. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you for making that connection for me, because I did watch that series. And so now I did not realize that you had a connection to the creator. So that's pretty great. I will definitely put that in the show notes for everybody, because I agree it was wonderful. Awesome. Okay. So next question for you. And I think you have alluded to this a little bit, but I want to ask you about the divine feminine. And I know that you mentioned that mother life, this relationship with nature is how you know and understand that. I am curious if there was a particular point in your journey when you became aware of the feminine aspect of the divine. And if you prefer divine feminine, sacred feminine, goddess, mother life, whatever language you want, you feel free to use that.
Thank you. There was a particular moment that was an epiphany for me. And it was soon after my father had died very suddenly of a heart attack. And I was brokenhearted. And I went to visit a friend who had a video shop. And she said, I'm going to lend you this video and I won't charge you, because I think it's so important that everyone needs to see it. And it's an hour-long film that was made in the early 90s. And it's available online. It's called The Burning Times. And when I took that video home, it blew my mind. It was the first time that I had ever understood certain things about myself that I had noticed, but never understood the root causes of, like my fear of speaking my truth in public. And the more I saw it, and I was kind of jaw-dropped, because I thought, how can this monumental event in human history, which occurred over about 300 years throughout Europe and in many other nations, had correlative sort of cultural movements. How can this have happened how can I not have learned about this in school? It's so huge. And then it set me on a course of research. And Really, I think up until that point, I had kind of imagined that I was stepping into my adult life on a level playing field in terms of gender equity. But my life had been showing me that that wasn't really true. My life had been, bringing me experiences of being the only woman in a board meeting and coming up with good ideas and having them fall on deaf ears, and the kind of implicit bias that I think every one of us probably in a female body has experienced in our own ways. And when I saw the Burning Times, it set me on an inquiry of research. And I had to understand how much of it was true and whether there were other societal ramifications of this time that I could help me understand it. And what I learned was that at the beginning of the Burning Times, women owned more wealth in Europe than men. And by the end of the Burning Times, there'd been this huge transfer of wealth. At the beginning of the Burning Times, women were the healers and the herbalists and the midwives and the death doulas. And by the end of the Burning Times, only men were allowed to into medical school, and you had to have a medical degree to practice medicine. So, and the women who were all those healers were among the first to be persecuted and tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches. At the beginning of the Burning Times, religion and spirituality was something that people experienced directly through rituals, seasonal rituals, more like what we think of as paganism. And there was a direct experience of the divine and the sacred that was open to anyone. And by the end of the Burning Times, you had to go to church to have an experience of the divine, and it had to be mediated through a priest. And even our relationship to land changed. So at the beginning of the Burning Times, land was held communally and shared as a resource. And by the end of the Burning Times, there was something called the enclosure movement, and land had become privatized. And so, what I realized was that 7 generations of children witnessed all the women in their lives, their mothers and sisters and aunties and grandmothers, become systematically tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And what I've come to believe since then, so that was just huge for me. And I had already been co-leading this organization called Bioneers for several years. And what happened for me was that Bioneers is all about solutions to all of our most pressing environmental and social challenges. And what I began to understand was that everything we were facing could be seen as the imbalance of the masculine and the feminine, not only in terms of our embodied forms and how women weren't in the C-suite and weren't getting the same opportunities or equity as men, but also in terms of the ideas and the principles that we associate with the masculine and the feminine. And in many ways, some may call it the divine feminine. I think we've inherited some pretty twisted definitions of the masculine and feminine, but so there's as much unpacking and unlearning to do as there is new learning to embrace. But what I found was that everything associated with the feminine, meaning our emotionality, our empathy, our compassionate natures, our ability to multitask, our way of sharing authority and being mindful of the context of everything we were dealing with, but particularly a focus on relationship. Everything associated with the feminine had been systematically devalued in our mainstream culture. And everything associated with a quote masculine, like action and goal orientation and productivity and upward versus downward and light versus dark and hierarchy and results, all of that had been elevated. And so I began to understand that everything we face can be seen as an imbalance of the masculine and the feminine. And in that way, what happened as a result of that was that I became fascinated with how my experience as a woman had uh, limited or expanded my sense of my possibilities, how it had affected my relationship to myself and the world. And also, I became a huge advocate for women and for what I called restoring the feminine, because many indigenous people and the Baha'i faith actually say that the bird of humanity has been trying for too long to fly on only one wing. And until the wing of the feminine is fully engaged and fully balanced, we will not achieve our full human potential. So that was kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but
It was
that was my experience.
it's a wonderful answer. And I wanted to share two things that came up when you mentioned the burning times. And the first was I saw that film as a young graduate student, and I took a gendered communications course in grad school. And it was so shocking to me that, and at the time, I was in a relationship with a man who was Catholic and carried a very kind of borderline macho, but paternal sort of energy. Like, I got this, I'm going to take care of this, which
Mm-hmm.
at that time in my life was comforting for me because I didn't grow up with that as a father. So
Right.
it appealed to me, but also not particularly open to ideas that were outside of what he thought was right and wrong. And so I remember that film being so very disruptive to me that I immediately saw it and was like, this is horrifying information. I can barely process this. And if I were to share this with my family of origin or my boyfriend, I would lose them. And
Wow.
even though I was in graduate school with strong female friends that I could talk about this with, for whatever reason, my perception of culture, being able to
Mm,
accept me if I were to bring this forward as something that was profoundly affecting me, uh, my perception was that I would lose. I would lose my culture. I would lose my family. I would lose love. And so I just shoved it all deep down, kind of forgot about that movie. And I didn't
mm,
really think about it for quite a while until I got called onto this divine feminine path. And then I could look
mm.
back and see, she's actually been calling me since my early 20s.
Right.
I wasn't in the place to receive and open to it.
Yeah.
Um, until I was, I needed to be, in
Yeah.
my case, I needed to literally be in a different city, which was the Bay Area of California, which was very open and receptive for me. I needed a lot of things in my life to shift. I needed that man to not be in my life anymore. But, you know, it was really jarring. And the other thing that I
Yeah.
want to mention about the burning times, I'll put a link in the show notes so you can look up this movie. But I remember reading later that there was a lot of controversy about the statistics that were used to quote the number of women that died during that time period. And this is, I think, is a common thing that happens to women's research. It is meticulously pulled apart. And if you find even one
Mhm.
thing that you think is wobbly, the whole thing gets thrown out. It's such a
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
ridiculous. But what I
Yeah.
wanted to name is that to me, the numbers, whether they're in the hundreds of thousands or the millions, doesn't matter. I will
Yeah.
give you an example of earlier this year, there was an active shooter on the campus of University of Virginia. I live
Mm.
10 miles outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, and my children go to school in the city of Charlottesville. The entire town was on lockdown
Oh.
until they found the shooter. The entire
Mm.
school, University of Virginia, all of these students, 30,000 of them, or however many are there, are getting text messages that say run, fight, hide for
Oh God.
hours. They can't leave their buildings. My children can't go to school. Every building, every office was shut down. And in the end, three people, three people were killed. And so you see the impact that the trauma that spills out. It doesn't, the number of people that died is horrible, but the number of people that are impacted by these acts of violence, we cannot reduce it to just a simple life and death like body count, because it's so much bigger than that. And so I don't know if that helps to bring into perspective what you were saying about seven generations. And even now to this day, and probably many of us who have been anywhere near where there's been an active shooter situation, we walk into public spaces, looking over our shoulders, checking for exits, trying to figure out where we're going to go. Is it safe to be in this space? So that's to say that it was a big deal. And especially for people that didn't process the trauma, it just gets
Yeah.
passed down and passed down and passed down.
Well, exactly. And you know what's been fascinating to me, Liz, is I've lived the question for a long time, why is patriarchy so entrenched? And it's a big question because the degree of implicit bias and the difficulty in getting the ERA passed in all kinds of things, is evidence of just how entrenched it is. And science has now proven what's called epigenetic trauma, which is that our DNA actually carries the trauma of our ancestors. And when you really feel into that and understand that we all have ancestors who lived through some aspect and some version of the burning times, that, wow, no wonder we as women tend to doubt our own capacities and make ourselves small, because it's not safe to show up in all our full flourishing.
Yes.
And yet we must, and we're called to. So, and thank heavens we live in a time where it's safer to do that than it was then.
Yes,
But yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And I think so many of us still feel like we're climbing over that mountain of fear
yeah.
just to open our voices. And I wonder if you might be willing to reflect on that, because I feel like you speak to that in your book, about finding your voice and standing up and using it. Do you feel like it's gotten easier over time? And is it is it something that practice makes it easier, or spiritual practice? Like, how's that evolved for you?
Liz, this is what I love about the title of your book and your podcast,
Mm.
because I loved thinking in anticipation about this, of what does coming home to myself mean and how has
Yeah.
it happened? Really, I think since seeing the burning times, which was nearly 30 years ago, I have been through a long process of self-reflection and self-practice and self-cultivation. For about 20 years, I co-facilitated gatherings for women called Cultivating Women's Leadership. And a lot of what we focused on was to unearth the story of what lies within, including the burning times and how its legacy affects us, but also what are the belief systems and the self-limiting ideas that we may have unconsciously accumulated that we can consciously shed. And I feel like, part of why I wrote this book and part of why I wrote the discussion guides and the embodied practices was so that anyone who picks it up can follow any part of my breadcrumb trail that can serve them. Because really, it's been practice. I feel like in many ways, the biggest lesson is, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to be a fully liberated in your, fullness woman? How do you come home to yourself? Well, you practice. And a lot of that was, really noticing that when I got out of the shower in the morning, I would look in the mirror and have all these negative voices go off in my head about my body. And, this is too fat and that's too round and I should be more, all the things that we all have. And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm doing violence to myself every single day. So how do I change that? Well, I created a ritual, and, I have, I had a spiritual trainer, a spiritual mentor, who gifted me at the end of a very long ritual with about 50 other people. He gifted us all with 9 words of spiritual advisement. And the 9 words are: consciousness creates matter, language creates reality. Let me do that again. The 9 words are: consciousness creates matter, language creates reality, ritual creates relationship. And when I heard that, all 3 of those phrases really landed in me. But the one that I wrapped my heart around the most was ritual creates relationship, because I knew that all those negative voices were a reflection of my inner relationship to myself. And they were what was keeping me from self acceptance, from self love, from believing in myself wholeheartedly. And so I created a ritual where I put together a skin oil with some essential oils that I love the scent of. And every morning, it only takes 3 or 4 minutes, I would anoint my body with this scented oil. And as I did so, I poured love and gratitude into my body. And what I learned from doing rituals as a form of practice is that they can be very simple, and we're all capable of making them up. But when you do them every single day and hold yourself accountable to doing them over and over and over again, somewhere around 6 or 8 weeks, something changes in your inner relationship, in my inner relationship. So I have, over time, really transformed my relationship to myself and my relationship to my husband, who at one point was a mentor, and I always compared myself to him. I had to shed and compost the habit of comparing myself with men, with other women, and compare myself only to myself. And in that way, I think I cultivated myself over a long period of time into who I felt my soul brought me here to be. And I want that for every woman alive on earth today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I love the thought of, I'm just thinking about you can turn anything into ritual. You can bring
Yeah,
meaning into anything. And
yeah,
so I'm thinking of the healing possibilities available for us and our beings. And then to your point about ritual creating relationship, it also deepens relationship to the world around you and to,
yes.
like, I have well, when I'm with it enough, which, doesn't happen every day, but, I have a little blessing that I put in I drink like a morning blend of mushroom tea type thing. And I have a little blessing that I put into it when I make it.
Mm-hmm.
And so and that blessing has to do with the relationship that I have to the beings that were involved in
Yeah,
bringing that drink to me. And so I'm thinking of that too, is like the whole ritual becoming a
yeah.
relationship, not just with self, but with all of these other amazing beings that we share the planet with too.
Exactly. And how do we cultivate a deepening of our relational intelligence? Which means, I mean, at one point, we had the worst wildfire in New Mexico's history last year. And
Mm.
at one point, it came too close to our home, which is right at the edge of a national forest. And I reached out to a friend and asked if she could teach me something that could help me protect my home. And she did. And she taught me a ritual to do with a tree. And it has to do with, it connects with consciousness creates matter, right? And
Mm.
every day I went out during the fire and I put flowers around the base of the trunk of the tree, and I poured water around the base. And I sent my gratitude and my prayers and my asking for forgiveness down into her roots and up through her branches to the sky people and to the mountain nearby. And it sure made me feel better. And our home didn't burn, and the fire eventually was put out. But, it deepened my relationship with this land that holds us. And I think it's certainly part of what the earth or Mother Life is asking of us now is, how do we deepen our relationship with all of life around us? And
Mhm.
certainly the indigenous allies we have are teaching us the same thing. They're all pointing in the same direction.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, okay, let's see if I can get this thought out. But I guess I was thinking about um, technology and all the systems that we've created to surround us and support us, and that are ultimately designed to keep us comfortable and in a place of stasis or perpetual growth, right? It's one or the
Mm.
other, right? We're just comfortable. We're just kind of trying to wrap ourselves up in a cozy blanket so nothing bad ever happens. And I'm thinking of that in conjunction with the same religious systems that we were talking about that pulled all
Mm.
of the wisdom out of individuals and out of their relationship with nature. Because I do think and I don't, it's been a long time since I've seen the Burning Times, but I'm sure she talks about the healers were working very closely with nature. It wasn't just
Yeah,
moving through your body. You're working with your natural systems like that are around
that's
you.
right.
Right. And
Yeah.
so all of that was taken away from people, put into, and I'm talking about European people of European descent. So let me just clarify that, put all into a church where I have the authority, a Father God has the authority, I will take care of everything. And all of that now is breaking down, right? It's all as we see this relationship with the earth, we cannot, I don't know, Nina, I want to hear your thoughts about this, but my feeling is that we cannot innovate our way out of a climate crisis using our human brains alone. I can't imagine how that's possible. And so moving into relationships seems essential
Yeah.
for um, any kind of survival at all. And finding a warm, cozy blanket of a different sort, which actually
Yes.
involves putting down a lot of your ideas of control.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's so many threads I could pull on in what you said, Liz, and it's kind of deep stuff. Um, I think that we are moving from an I culture to a we culture.
Yeah.
And I think that really the greatest security we can hope for lies in community
Yeah.
and in connecting not only to our human neighbors and to developing local food resilience and power supports and knowing what your watershed is and where does your water come from and how do you help secure that, but also literally cultivating relationships with the myriad species of the natural world around us and the elements. Because I think, I just heard a fascinating talk by Zach Bush,
Mm.
who says, that humans' greatest gift, well, humans' greatest challenge is that we are the only species that creates monocultures.
Mm.
And if you look at the church systems, right, they tend to be not very multicultural, right?
Yeah.
And so this is where multiculturalism and diversity is not just a good idea. It's not just political correctness. It's about creativity and survival. Because in nature, the places of greatest innovation are the places where two or more ecosystems meet. And,
Yes.
when we stretch to connect with people who don't look like us and people who have very different backgrounds, we're actually cultivating resilience in ourselves and each other. And it takes courage to do that, but the rewards are just immense. And really, so I think you're right that we're not going to innovate our way out through only our minds. I think that actually, what a lot of my indigenous teachers have taught me is that often for white people, the greatest distance is the distance between mind and heart, and that we need to learn to lead from our hearts and from our bellies. And I
Mhm.
think part of the gift of the divine feminine is learning to trust that, when we meet someone, we know right away whether we have an affinity with them or whether some part of our gut says, oh, be careful. You know, we know, we can feel it. And I think that, what science is proving is that there is actually a huge amount more capacity for generative energy and ideation and, if you will, imagining and creativity that comes from our hearts and our guts than from our minds. So I think it's been part of the imbalance of the human experiment over the last couple thousand years has been an over reliance on thinking and not enough on feeling and intuiting and dreaming and getting our minds to still so that we can sense with our bodies better.
Hmm. Yes, I'm so glad that you named the edges too, like working like with the edges
Mhm.
and the diversity there. And that was one of my favorite things about your book was some of your writing about working with women from different cultures and women of
Mm.
color and some of the challenges that you had faced there. And I am wondering if you could speak to, was there a process for you in terms of tuning into gender bias that also led to your understanding of racial bias, and how
Yes.
did that play out for you? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the dedication in my first book was my recognition that being in a female body offered me an empathic window on injustice of all kinds. Because, you know, we all know what it feels like to be treated as second class citizens.
Yeah.
And, we have a Supreme Court now who, of course, is relegating us back to some second class, not in charge of our own bodies, citizens.
Yeah.
And which is infuriating, but hopefully it's going to help us rise up. And so, I think that, yes, I do think that we are creatures of empathy. We are fundamentally social creatures, which is, part of what we have to remember as
Mhm.
we cultivate ourselves to meet this time. Because honestly, Liz, I think we're just at the beginning of a time that will be harder as we go along before
Yeah.
it gets easier. And I think that because I've been studying climate and pollution and, what we've done to the earth for 30 some years. And it's tough and not easy. And we have a lot of habits to break.
Yeah.
I just heard a geologist say every time you send a text, you're using as much energy as if you boil a cup of water. So,
What?
right? So,
Oh,
because of think of all the places it has to be beamed and back and forth and right
yes.
and wild. So, we have all these unconscious habits that we've assumed are all okay. And in the meantime, there is amazing innovation that's coming up. I also just saw scientists just created a kind of white paint that can reflect like 89% of the sun's heat
I
to
saw
use
that.
on roofs, right?
Yeah.
So fascinating. So I think it's some combination of, there's a great quote that we use in Bioneers called human ingenuity wedded to the wisdom of the wild.
Mm.
And nature knows how to survive. And I think it's important to say, we're not going to save the world. We're going to save ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Nature will survive. It may take a few million or billion years to get over us. But the question is, what can we do to strengthen our own resilience and our own capacity to adapt to what we've wrought and what our ancestors have wrought? And, I think an awful lot of that has to do with shifting our attention from bigness to local and getting involved in local politics and local support systems, local life support systems, because
Mm.
I love having a neighbor that I can buy eggs from. I love having a neighborhood phone tree so that if there's a fire, we can be in touch with each other and know if there are dogs to save and all that stuff. And so I do think the answer lies in community and connection and diversity. And
Mm.
I often feel like too much is made and too many people talk about the challenges or the difficulty of entering into diversity work and forming connections with people who are different than us. But not enough is said about the incredible joy and virtues of having a community of people who don't all think alike
Mm-hmm.
and who can love each other um, while holding our differences.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a lot of the lesson of this time in our human ecology is how do we have differences and still be able to love each other and find connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like a lot of your work with Bioneers has been about bringing together different peoples from different communities. And I'm curious, if that what that process has been like for you and your lessons. You have a really wonderful chapter in your book about rupture and repair.
Mhm.
But I'm thinking of, I think of white women in particular with this sort of dichotomy of being being tasked with holding like a hold on, let me organize my thoughts here, because I want to make sure I get this right. I can edit this part out. Yes. Okay. So it's this patriarchal conditioning that I think we have, where we got to get things right. We are responsible for other people's emotions. We're responsible for other people's experiences.
Yeah.
And we have to do that perfectly. And if that falls, that's on us. And so I think, particularly when I'm talking about reaching out to women who are Black women or Indigenous women, or women who, like, we hold privilege that they don't have, to
Yes.
step out and to acknowledge that and to reach out and to be willing to mess that up, which is almost, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, but I would think it's almost inevitable that we're going to mess it up because we have no
Yeah.
practice doing so. Um,
Yes.
so to do that and be willing to be seen as royally messing it up, and also do it in a patriarchal culture that was really hard on women for messing up in general, where none of us are immune from that. It's sticky stuff, right? And so I'm curious if you could speak to how that's been for you through your work with Bioneers, and the the stumbles
Sure.
perhaps, and the evolution of that.
Sure. Um, well, I would say first that, part of my own inquiry about what it has meant to be a person with the privileges that our society affords those of us with white skin
Yeah.
has been to recognize that um, I tend to assume leadership. I tend to assume that I'm sort of in the um, knowledgeable position or the beneficent position. And what I have found is that um, it's incredibly important in reaching out to connect with people of other backgrounds, to acknowledge my own privilege up front. First of all, to literally name it and say, I'm working to undo this, but I may make mistakes. And so I'm going to ask you to be kind and forgiving up front. Um, I think also that, what I've found is that I have to show up in a position of humility
Mhm.
and with the recognition that it's no one else's responsibility to teach me. Because I think as white women, we tend to think, well, if I ask a person of color to teach me about racial justice, that I'm doing them a favor.
Mm.
Well, actually, no,
Yeah.
you're asking them to do emotional labor that is hard for them.
Yeah.
And frankly, what I found is that, if we imagine taking all the times that we have felt slighted simply because of our gender,
Yeah.
it's what in anti-racist work is called microaggressions, you know?
Yeah.
And if you imagine putting all of those together, what I what I have learned um, is that for people of color in this society, their experience of the microaggressions that happen to them every single day is voluminous. It's exponentially bigger than anything we can imagine
Mhm.
for the ways that we have experienced bias against us as women. And one African American friend said to me, "It's as if we're both scaling a mountain that's covered with ground glass, and you have thick tennis shoes on, and I'm barefoot.
Mm.
It's as if that, right? That's how I experience the inequities in our systems."
Mm.
And when I hear mothers talk about how fearful they are when their kids go to the grocery store because they might get arrested for something they didn't even do, or they're going to get shadowed, or they're, I mean, all those things. It's really devastating.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I've been very fortunate in that, as Bioneers, as an organization, we were mentored from the very beginning by some very wise Native elders. And so it's really in our DNA to have that awareness of multiculturalism and the value of lifting up those who have been undervalued. And, one of the things I write about in the book was that I had an experience of discovering that my awareness about racial inequity had lived in my head but not pierced my heart.
Yeah.
And the moment when it pierced my heart really changed me. And it's worth reading. It's a good story. I don't want to take all the time now. But, the other thing that I would mention, Liz, in this regard is that I had an aha moment when I read a book called Women Lead the Way by a woman named Linda Tarr Whelan, Whelan. And one of the things that she says in that book is that for any minority to feel fully flanked, to be able to fully express their truth, they have to achieve a benchmark of 30% of the whole. So when I read that, I suddenly realized we had been doing multicultural deep dive immersion retreats for many years. But suddenly I went back to my colleagues and I said, we have to set a minimum of 30% women of color in every cohort. And as soon as we did that, and we have to have one of 3 facilitators be a woman of color. And as soon as we did those 2 things, the quality of engagement of the whole thing completely changed. And when you think about that in relation to our current systems and structures, where we don't have 30% women in the House or Senate, we don't have 30% women in any legislative body, or in C-suites or in the law, in any kind of leadership capacity. Meanwhile, all the data that's coming in around the world says that women in leadership is the best thing for climate change. It's the best thing to achieve peace and security. It's the best, it's good for every single system. It alleviates poverty. It helps food security. It helps water. It helps the environment. It helps everything. And so, how do we collectively take on the challenge and the beautiful vision of lifting each other up to be able to achieve that gender parity in all of our systems? Because that's the world I want to work toward.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
And, the other thing that I would just say is that I am particularly in service to Indigenous women and other women of color, because I believe that in addition to all the gifts that the divine feminine confers on all of us in female bodies, and many men, by the way, in male bodies, that women of color have experienced hardship in ways that makes them uniquely suited to help lead us through this time of so much challenge and turbulence. And so my sense is one of the best things we can do as white women is show up in humility and servitude and say, how can I help? You tell me, what do you need? How can I help?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only about money, it's about volunteering time. It's about helping care for their kids, or, there are so many ways, and every little bit counts. And I think our actions mean a lot more than our words, because so many of our words have been hollow promises.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You're reminding me of something a friend said to me. We were having philosophical conversation about capitalism and money and how do we think about economics in a different way. And I was thinking about something that I wanted to do, and like, how do you reconcile the fact that we need money to eat and yet you don't want money to be your primary driver? And my friend was like, I just want to stop you and tell you that anything that you're trying to figure out right now, a Black woman or woman of color or an Indigenous woman is probably already working on it. And
right.
And I think the point is not to tokenize anybody, but to say perhaps to your friends or to the to the analogy that I think you said it was your friend, right, who was walking on broken glass
Mm-hmm.
versus the shoes, being
Mm-hmm.
so intimately close to the problems at hand because of being affected by them so much more personally than I would
Yeah.
have. So rather than
Yeah.
me going out, assuming the leadership, as you said, let me try and figure
Yep.
out a different way to do this, and then I shall teach you all how to do it, recognizing that maybe somebody else has already figured it out, and go learn from them, follow them, share their
Exactly.
work, pay them whatever I can do. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
I think what she actually said was, you know, white people are walking upright with thick shoes, and people of color are on our hands and knees
yeah,
going up the same hill
yeah,
on broken glass
yeah,
with no shelter, no
yeah,
shield, no
yeah,
nothing.
yeah,
And it rings true.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 Well, and I feel like you've referenced this multiple different ways, but I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about Indigenous perspectives, how that's been a part of Bioneers and what that's been like to
Mm.
have that wisdom guiding you. And I guess a related question to that would be around, I think so many of us, people of European descent, we look back at our traditions of origin and feel like there's not much there to guide us. And so
Mhm.
uh, I think it's almost natural to look to other cultures to say, wow, we
Yeah.
really screwed it up. Will you please show me what to do? But I wonder if you could speak to that, um,
Mm.
threading the needle between honoring versus appropriating as well.
Yeah. Um, I just read the most beautiful essay and by Lila June
Hmm.
about connecting with her European ancestors because
Oh,
she's
yeah.
got half European ancestry and half indigenous. And it's a beautiful thing to post for listeners. Um, you know, what we consider is that indigenous peoples are the first pioneers. They're the ones who have always known how to live in right relationship to the natural world and to each other. And, you know, what many people don't know is that the US Constitution was actually written with guidance from the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Six Nations Confederacy, and that they actually helped inform the Constitution. And at that time, they met with those elders and they said, where are your women? How can your women not be involved in this? And this thing of slavery, it's going to bite you in the ass one day. You need to deal with this. And of course, they didn't, or didn't until much later.
Yeah.
And in the tradition of the Haudenosaunee, the women actually select the male leader for the nation, and they select them by watching the boy children and seeing which of them has the qualities of the awareness of the good of the whole, of the empathy, of the caring, of the kindness that they believe is necessary for the leadership for the tribe. And they select that leader. And they also have the authority to rescind his leadership if he's ever not performing well. Um, so there are so many ways. I mean, I think I talk about this some in the book, that there are examples of social structures that we can learn from, like the forced societies that the Okanagan people do. And, that's a system. You asked earlier about systems. What do I mean by that? That's a way of thinking about who we are as human beings. And I
Hmm.
think it's a good time to be thinking about who we are as human beings because our old definitions aren't working so well in relation to the world. So, there's that. There's the social ecology. There's also what's called traditional ecological wisdom, which is how do we relate to the soil and fire and air and water and those systems that, in traditional ecological knowledge, you don't harvest medicines from a plant before you pray and ask its forgiveness, ask its willingness. You make an offering to the plant, and you very consciously take only what you can use and not more than the plant can regenerate. And that's a huge body of agricultural wisdom that we don't even remotely have, right?
Right.
You know, and they know how to cultivate an ecosystem to optimize for diversity, which is what we have to do right now. And so there is so much to be learned from them. And how do we learn from their principles without doing cultural appropriation?
Yeah.
Well, some of it is about educating ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, I just saw an amazing show on MSNBC last night. I'm sure folks can look it up online, called The Culture is Indigenous Women. And it's fantastic. And, part of what we have to learn is things like Native peoples are not one group. There are over 570 federally recognized tribal nations in this country, and a lot more that are not yet federally recognized. And each of those nations has their own culture, and each of them have been through their own historical experience. And some are matriarchal and some are not, and some have been more affected by colonialism and capitalism and Catholicism. So it's a hugely diverse realm. We have to not stereotype them. We have to not assume that it's their job to teach us. And we have to educate ourselves and recognize that they are some of the most effective defenders of land and water and human safety right now that exist on the planet. And they're also defending most of the world's last remaining areas of biodiversity. And so I think it's possible to learn from their principles, to learn from their cosmology, to learn from how they relate to each other and the world. And not to trivialize or stereotype them, not to assume we know, to show up in real humility. I think, again, that's part of the curse of white supremacy culture, is to imagine that we know. And actually, there is deep, deep wisdom in all of their cultures. And to show up in service and humility and curiosity, I think is the best thing we can do. And not wear feathers and, and support their arts and their cultures and recognize that culture is appropriation. So, it's a tricky thing. I try to not wear Native jewelry unless it's vintage or been gifted to me, or I'm supporting a Native artisan. And all of those things are fine, but to not dress like an Indian, and to focus more on behavior than on costume or affect.
Yeah. That's so all so helpful. And the Coalition of Natives and Allies that I met, well, there's so many organizations you can turn to, but that one that I mentioned that I'm going to put in the show notes, they've got some great recommendations. If there's any parents out there who want to champion some things at your children's schools, they've got some good suggestions there on things to look at too. I also think of appropriation really intersecting with capitalism and what and trying to sell teachings from another person's sacred traditions. That to me is also hits really like a no-no. Like it's unless you've got permission or whatever, there's always different circumstances, but that to me also feels like you're getting into some not okay territory.
I mean, most of the Native people that I know reject the word shaman. It's not okay with them, It's within their cultures that they have healers or medicine people. But, also that if you're quoting somebody or sharing something that you learned from a Native person, give them credit for it, name them. That's really important. You don't borrow people's information without giving them credit. And often asking free, informed, and prior consent is really important. Like, would it be okay if I quote you on that? If you're writing something that you learned from a Native person, that's really important too. And, for parents out there, we also have beautiful materials on the Bioneers website about Thanksgiving. There's a Thanksgiving book you can share with your kids, and Thanksgiving rituals and how to reframe Thanksgiving. because it's a very different story than most of us learned.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to make sure I get that. I've got a lot of things to put in the show notes for you all. So be sure to actually visit them for this episode. Okay, I have one last question for you because I knew this was going to go really fast, Nina. But one of the things that you write about in your book is the importance of stories that we are seeding.
Mm,
And
mm,
you write about how, and I think you quoted Charles Eisenstein, like we're living in between stories right now, or we're
mm.
like the stories that we've told. I literally look at this with my kids and like the movies. They're super into Star Wars right now.
Oh,
And there's some good messages to Star Wars. There
mhm,
are. And yet
mhm.
my heart is just like, oh my God, can we not figure out a way to solve our problems without death and war? Like
Yeah,
everything that we think is
yeah,
bad, we try to kill.
yeah.
So I guess my final question for you is what story or stories do you feel like through Bioneers and through your presence in the world you're trying to seed or you're envisioning for
Hmm.
us and for future generations? Just a light question to end us upon.
Well, I mean, their stories of interconnection is
Mhm.
the truth. And there are a bunch of them out there, and we're all co inventing them all the time. I think we have to actually, it's important that we reimagine what it means to be a leader, what it means to be an activist, what it means to be an artist, because I believe we're all leaders and activists and artists. And, we're all storytellers. And the beautiful stories that I love are like, Whale Rider and that incredible story about the eagle huntress. And, right. And, I war is the greatest single contributor to climate change.
Mm,
And so we have to lift up the stories of coevolution, of how it's not one hero, it's a group of heroes,
yeah.
right? And it's collaborating with other species. It's learning and being with other species. The James Cameron movies are a
Mm,
good example of some of that, although they're also war,
yeah.
and conflict. But I think, and some of the Pixar movies do that too, and I love them.
Mhm.
What's that one that's in and out, inner and outer? Um,
Oh, Inside
you know what
Out
I
or
mean?
something like that.
Yes,
Yes,
Inside
yes.
Out. It's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
So I think we need to embrace the stories that integrate core spiritual principles of the divine feminine and inclusivity and valuing and revering diversity and the magic of and mystery of nature, because we have to lift up for our children and for each other all the ways that nature is not a thing, but is our home, and
Mhm.
our home that is filled with 4 billion years of wisdom and adaptive, resilient brilliance. And that science is only beginning to barely scratch the surface of understanding. And
Mhm.
so I think we need to lift the stories of humility and of kindness and of co-creativity. And my husband and partner wrote a beautiful short poem about Bioneers that for me kind of encapsulates it, which is it's all alive. It's all intelligent. It's all, oh, hold on. Wow. It's all alive. It's all intelligent. It's all relatives.
Mm.
And really, how different when we think of this tree that we love in our yard, or the plant that's growing that we are, that's perceiving us even as we're loving it. What happens when we start to pour our love and affection through our feet when we're walking on the earth? We cultivate relationship. It's a ritual that cultivates relationship. And I think that's one of the healthiest things we can do for coming home to ourselves and coming home to the earth and coming home to each other.
Mhm. Mm. Thank you so much for bringing that all the way back around too with our home to her. That was beautiful.
Oh, my
Oh,
pleasure.
thank you so much, Nina. What a gift to be in conversation with you. I feel like we could
Mm,
have kept talking for hours, but this was so rich and so nourishing to my soul. So thank you.
thank you. It's a
Mhm.
joy to be with you and your listeners, Liz.
Mhm.
Thank you for cultivating this beautiful community
Mm.
that's so needed at this time.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for listening. As I'm so grateful that you're here and that you want to tune in. And as always, if you like the show, you can leave it a favorable review. You can tell your friends about it. You can subscribe to it. You can do all those things. And until next time, I hope you take really good care of yourself, and I will
Mm.
speak to you again soon.